Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Security Studies, ISS. My name is Karen Allen. I'm going to be chairing today's session. Just need to quickly acknowledge that we, of course, to be able to have events like this, are very much reliant on our donors, our partnership forum. This seminar will be also webcast, it will be simultaneously webcast, so we again extend a welcome to our online audience, and we're looking forward to a engagement here with our panelists, who I'll introduce to you in just a few minutes. You might remember a few months ago we had a seminar on the fourth industrial revolution and its threat to human security, and I recognise a few people in the audience who attended that. And we promised, because it's such a big area, to try and break it down into a number of key seminars, looking at very specific issues related to the unintended consequences of this extraordinary technological revolution that the world is facing. And I talk about advances in technology because this is not about having a downer on tech. What we're trying to do here is to look at the potential, but also the pitfalls, and being able to build resilience to some of the vulnerabilities that this massive technological revolution is happening. So today we're talking about elections, and we're talking about elections in Africa. Why elections are important? Well, of course, they're a litmus test of democratic consolidation at a time when large numbers of people globally feel disconnected with the world and with politicians, let's face it. Elections are far from perfect, but they're the best thing that we've got at the moment. So it's important that they're conducted in a way that's transparent and that is free and fair. But it also explains why political aspirants are going the extra mile to make sure that they get traction in social media and on other such platforms. We've obviously had rapid digitalisation, which has enabled technological and information transfer at the most extraordinary speed, and of course the accumulation of big data. And the context of elections, it's opened up space to do incredible things, to give voice to people who previously had none. It's provided space for human rights advocates to express their views, and also to report, of course, transgressions when things go wrong, and to report them in real time. But of course there are also cons. It's exposed vulnerabilities and provided a platform for advancing hate speech, causing divisions, for example, ethnic or racial or religious divisions. And here in South Africa, we've had experience of that, of course, with some of the posts that were put on social media during some of the xenophobic violence. It's given the opportunity to manipulate or to distort messages and provide valuable personal data to commercial entities who then use them to achieve commercial ends. Of course, a lot of this has been doing this from time immemorial, but what the rapid digitization is doing is it's allowing this to happen at an enormous speed. It's got a multiplier effect, and that's why, particularly in this part of the world, we really do need to take note of it. And despite the many other challenges that the continent faces, we can't afford to just sit by and let this digital revolution happen and affect our elections potentially without at least being aware of some of the pitfalls. Now, because of time constraints, we're not going to talk so much on the impact of digitisation on the actual process of voting, on how people cast their ballot, how those ballots are counted and tallied, collated and so forth. Instead, we want to focus largely on the dissemination of messaging, freedom of speech and personal privacy issues in the lead up to elections. And we've got an extremely eminent panel with us. To my left, we've got advocate Avani Singh. She's a lawyer and by training, and she has an interest in information rights. She's a co-founder of Alt Advisory, and she focuses on data privacy, on information rights and public law. And she advises clients on media law, on freedom of expression, online and offline regulation. And she's produced an extremely useful map, a data map, and also publications on the different laws pertaining to freedom of expression across the continent as part of a UNESCO project. representing the Election Commission of South Africa. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Nomsa Masuku. Although she was appointed as Election Commissioner just last year, obviously you've got a long history with the Election Commission, and you were previously Deputy Chief Electoral Officer responsible for outreach. She's also had a long career in academia and also in business, and a strong track record in promoting civic education. I'm also delighted to welcome our industry voice to the panel. We have Thea Walker from Microsoft. Microsoft, of course, is one of the biggest players on the market. It owns Skype, it owns LinkedIn. And Thea Walker, again, you're an advocate by training, so we've got lots of lawyers in the house, responsible for legal compliance, but you also have a particular interest in emerging technologies and artificial intelligence and the impact on access to information. So welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
I'm going to give you the floor, each of you, for about 5 minutes or so, to give us an indication of what you see as the biggest challenges as you would see them to this rapid deployment of digital technology in the election space, particularly in Africa, and where in so many parts of the world we're trying to digest the enormous opportunities and pitfalls of this emerging technology. Avni, let's start with you.
Thank you so much. So I suppose I want to start, picking up on a point that Karen made, that some of these challenges that we're dealing with are not necessarily new. And one of my sort of favorite anecdotes around this is that in the early 20th century, when the automobile was first invented, cars and streetlights at a street level was the first time that people encountered this kind of technology. And in the US, for example, there was a debate on the moral character of the automobile vehicle. And ultimately, they decided that it was not inherently evil, but that they would liken it to being akin to a wild animal, for example, and try and regulate it in the same way. So there's a lot of confusion, I suppose, and mysticism that comes with each evolution of technology. But perhaps what is significant about these new developments is the speed, the rapidity, the vastness of the audience that we're dealing with. And that, I think, legitimately brings with it a new realm of apprehension as well. This, of course, brings new opportunities and new risks as well. And that does, I think, mean that we do need new responses and new rules of engagement when we're talking about how we address these challenges. I do want to say, though, that I am, first and foremost, tech evangelist. I believe fundamentally in the power of the internet and the good that it can provide. Access to the internet and technology has led to unprecedented opportunities to seek, receive, and impart political information and ideas, which is essentially the lifeblood of elections and democracy. And it's easier for politicians, political parties, and the electorate to engage, to criticize, to dissent, and that is incredibly important and something that must be protected. It's also possible to mobilize, to engage in to bring community organizations to the floor, and to hear voices from more far-flung and remote places, as well as across borders. The response to this, of course, that we've seen across in a number of African jurisdictions has been an inclination to shutting down the internet, particularly during election periods, in an effort particularly to stifle that criticism. And sometimes we see arguments such as national security being raised, often, I think, disingenuously, and in my view, an internet shutdown is never a proportionate response when you take it in line with the limitation on freedom of expression. There are fundamentally more tailored, tapered responses that we can deal with. Internet shutdowns fundamentally limit the right to freedom of expression, access to information, and political rights more generally. So if we accept, I suppose, that access to the internet is a component of freedom of expression, of the exercise of political rights, the next step is making sure that the information that we access on the internet is credible, reliable, and trustworthy. One way in which I think this can be done is by states taking on more responsibility in making sure that better, more credible information is proactively disclosed online. The African Commission has developed a set of guidelines on access to information and elections in Africa and lists a series of good practices in terms of what information should be disclosed, including information around political party funding. And it applies to a number of different actors in the kind of spectrum of election management, including election management bodies, internet service providers, political parties, and so on. But we've seen very slow uptake of these guidelines and quite a lot of reticence, I suppose, to taking those steps and moving this discussion forward and really breaking past the sort of brotherhood of secrecy that we've seen and the tendency to want to keep information more closed. And what that's resulted in, I think, is electorate and members of the electorate needing to rely on information online, on social media, for example, to find the information that they're looking for, but unfortunately struggling, I suppose, to always verify the accuracy and the credibility of that information. In Notes of a Native Son, James Baldwin, writing in a very different time, in a different context, commented that, but no one was interested in the facts. They preferred the invention because this invention expressed and corroborated their hates and fears so perfectly. And so one of the big discussions, I suppose, on the next kind of issue that I want to touch on of false information and mis and disinformation is this idea that it's not entirely clear the extent to which fake information changes people's views as opposed to cements their views. But I think what the Cambridge Analytica scandal really revealed to us is that it's not the people who have already formed their views that the targeting is aimed at. It's the people on the margins who haven't quite made up their mind yet. It's that slim, narrow category where they can still be persuaded that we're really dealing with. So even if the overarching concept of false news or misinformation is not in itself new, it's the ease with which this can be spread and, I suppose, targeted. I do want to flag in the context of talking about false information that the terminology for us in sort of human rights space has become increasingly important, particularly as we've seen the term fake news increasingly politicized to stifle legitimate criticism and to undermine genuine information in an effort to discredit the journalists or the people bringing that information forward. So disinformation is the term used where it's intentionally spread, where false information is intentionally spread. And misinformation is the term used where it's unintentionally spread. The person on WhatsApp, my mother, for example, who just forwards the message that she received, saying that there are different election days for depending on which political party you're voting for. Now, my mother is a well-educated, considered, informed person, but still fell prey to these kinds of silly scandals that happen. And I think false information like this is particularly dangerous when we combine it with information that's either intended to harm or undermine the credibility of an election, or where you're combining it with hate speech, incitement, or other kinds of dangerous speech. I think the other risk that disinformation, misinformation poses is that it ultimately destabilizes the broader democratic conversations because it fundamentally erodes the trust that we have in institutions. It becomes difficult to know what's true or not. One of the other pieces of information that we saw spread during the election period was that a voting ballot needed to be stamped on both sides to be a legitimate voting ballot. Now that's correct information, but we would get reports of it about that being false information, and suddenly people were no longer sure about what was true and what was not. I think these challenges are exacerbated by low levels of digital literacy and perhaps low levels of education more broadly, where being able to verify and be able to make sure that the information is credible becomes increasingly challenging. The second thing that I wanted to touch on is the micro-targeting of groups and political advertising online. We've seen more campaign spending taking place online through channels other than traditional media, and in doing so, obviating some of the rules that have been put in place to protect political advertising. This is not necessarily covered by the existing frameworks, and so we're seeing that the transparency rules around political advertising lag behind when it comes to social media, for example, as opposed to broadcast media or print media, where there are very clear rules and regulations in place for this. Political micro-targeting has increasingly been used for political advertising. And this is a particular challenge, I think, where in a country, in African countries, where one, there's a lack of effective data protection frameworks in place to effectively protect the use of that information, and two, where there are no registered offices of the big tech companies, where you have a port of call, where you can raise these issues, or your regulators can effectively challenge what's taking place. And as Karen mentioned, there's a serious risk when this happens of violent consequences arising, where ethnic, religious, or regional tensions can lead to inter-community violence, and this is just exacerbated by one, false information, or two, distorted information. Because I think increasingly what we're seeing is something that is not patently, outrightly, outrageously false, but a mix of false information combined with credible information that makes it harder to discern. And the last thing I want to mention, I suppose, in the context of elections is this idea of dismantling political resistance. So where the use of social media is used to criticize the government, we're seeing arrests of opponents, arrests of journalists, intimidation and harassment. And this is particularly egregious, I think, when we're dealing with female candidates and female journalists who face a disproportionate level of harassment and different forms of harassment and threats online. So I think, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the strategies and the frameworks that we want in place, but just as an overview, these are some of the risks that I think are key for me.
That's great. I mean, thank you very much. And also very, very interesting, you've got tangible examples there. Mm-hmm. And these are real life examples that you've encountered. Thank you. Well, Dr. Masuka, you've just come back from election observation missions in Botswana and in Mozambique.
In Mozambique.
And so you've come fresh from the coalface, so to speak. Just some of your observations as a first, not just of those two places, but just in terms of the growing importance that sort of messaging via digital means is having in our elections.
Okay. Thank you very much, Karen, and hello to everyone. I'd like to dial down a little bit and start by talking about something that I think that is fairly mundane. I think that is so mundane that I think we forget to its significance when we talk about the topic, like the topic that we're talking about today. It is what are elections? What's the role of elections? Why do we pay so much attention to elections? Why do they matter so much? And I'd like to begin by saying that fundamentally what an election is, contrary to a lot of suppositions that people make, elections are not equivalent to democracy. They're an important part of democracy, but certainly not the democracy itself. And I think on the African continent, that is something that we need to talk about a little bit more. So elections are there in order to help the citizenry to choose their representatives. That's what an election is for. So you've got to contest in order for someone to give you the right to represent them in a particular area, for example. That's the role of elections. So in order to achieve that, you need to have certain rules that allow the contestants to vie for that, to play in that context and make sure that the space is fair. That is where election management bodies come in. Election management bodies come in not just to organize the election, but also to set the rules for how people, for how political parties contest for elections. And the job of an election and management body, its biggest concern, is to make sure that the outcome of the election is reflective of what the voters intended. That's what it is. So the numbers that come out should be an accurate representation, an aggregated representation of what the voters want. Anything that gets in between that very fairly simple equation is a problem because it affects the integrity of elections. I think a lot of the time we get caught up in things that seem very, very complex. It's quite a simple concept. The concept is that when a voter goes into a voting booth, they need the assurance that what it is that is going to come out is reflective of what it is that they put in, and you aggregate all of those things. So you see where I'm going with this. Where I'm going with this is that today's conversation shows us that what has happened is that we see a lot of players that have come in between the voter and the contestants. So we're talking about the architecture of political campaigns. Political campaigns should be a method of telling me why you are the best candidate for you to represent my interests in this whatever space that is, whether it is a legislature or it is, for heaven's sake, it could very well be a school governing body. That is what I need to get there. When there are players that are introduced into that big picture, where you have big data, you have people who sell that data, and all the things that my colleague Avani has spoken about, that space is muddied because it is no longer what I would call a clean space where you are dealing with just a person who's a political party that is coming to say to me, I am the best suited, I have the best fit in terms of your interest. Someone else comes in and says, I can do something else. So the vulnerabilities that Avani has talked about, and I do say her name wrong all the time. I think she's Avani. That's right. Yes, and it is just that simple fact that when big data comes in, when people are micro-targeted in order to influence how they perceive who their potential representative is, then that changes the quality of the integrity of the outcome. It is as simple as all of that. And we can sit here the entire day and talk about it, but it is quite a simple phenomenon. It is to say that, am I making this choice on the basis of good information? Am I making it on the basis of untainted information? Am I allowed to work through the data as best as I can in order to arrive at a decision? And yes, as Avani has said, we've always had propaganda. We've always had all kinds of methodologies for swaying how we perceive things, but not with the intensity that we see in the days of the explosion of the digital spaces in Africa, especially, where you have a huge explosion of just the volumes of information that you get, and people's inability to work through that information systematically and arrive at a conclusion. Add in onto that picture, in Africa, you also have a little thing that happens where we don't have issues-based campaigning. So there is that. So we've always known that these things happen. But I think what we need to distill today is how we deal with the things that we can control. So the things that have to do with disinformation, a deliberate attempt to make people believe that something is what it is not, to increase fear so that people behave in a particular way that had that fear not been there, they would have behaved slightly differently. That is the issue. For us as election management body, this falls outside the scope of what election management bodies are normally tasked with. It normally falls in the space of, in South Africa, for example, other regulators, information regulators, for example. It falls into that space. The election management body itself does not manage that space. But the election management body has to live with that outcome. It has to live with an outcome where you know that the competition has not been fair. It has not been fair because there's evidence that is irrefutable evidence that there has been tainting of that space. And I'm going to leave it there, and the rest you can pick up in the conversation.
Really, really helpful. Thank you. Theo, you're not big bad industry. You're not the one that's tainting the message, but it's interesting because often it is presented as a them and us situation. And what I think is very interesting like to hear your thoughts in a minute, is the fact that industry is talking about exactly these issues of truth, these issues of trust, these issues of legality, these issues of ethics. What do you see as the challenges ahead?
I think let me take a step back in terms of just being able to answer that question, because it's a fundamental shift, and the shift that I've gone through in the nearly 10 years that I've been at Microsoft starts to sort of speak to that issue. I remember negotiating an agreement with one of the large government organizations just down the road over here, and it was very, very simple. You have a quick discussion around some confidentiality issues, you come to a compromise, and you leave. And that was that. There was no issue of trust, there was no issue of security really. We as an organization sold your software and we moved on. And 10 years later, as we've seen the move into the cloud world, and as we've seen the move into artificial intelligence, almost the ubiquity of what we have, technology swirling all around us, my role has changed fundamentally. I now no longer deal with a specific clause. I'm looking at the ethics of what it is we're doing. We're looking at the value proposition that our software, our cloud services, and artificial intelligence services provide. And this fundamental change in what was my role has been picked up by Microsoft as a corporation. And what you see is interesting campaigns that we've launched that are fundamental to what it is that we're doing as an organization that supports global economies. And what we really are talking about is trust. I've already mentioned it. Everything is about trust. So how do we engender that trust? Satya Nadella, as our CEO, has turned around and said, if you do not fundamentally trust your technology, you're not going to use it. It's as simple as that. So Microsoft has worked particularly hard on developing frameworks, developing foundational instances where we look at privacy, where we look at security, where we look at transparency, to ensure that as our technology is used around the globe, it is used in a manner that represents the values of human nature. It's always been interesting for me to be able to walk into an organization and sort of say to them, hey, what are your privacy issues? When last did you run through a set of standards that support a particular privacy establishment? Are you ISO 27018 compliant? Where do you stand on GDPR? And from a Microsoft perspective, I'm always glad to be able to say, here are our standards, here's our compliance, this is how we achieve that, and can we work with you in order to achieve that? So when it comes to, I think, the digital age, elections in Africa, I don't think we have any different role to play as a technology giant. We're there to ensure that you can trust the technology, and the question is, and how do we go about it? And I think that it probably rests on two pillars. You got the pillar of education and working together with people, and then you got the technology. How do we create that transparency? How do we assist the electoral commissions? How do we assist the voter to use the technology in a way that they can trust it? So I don't have a lot more to add. I think what the ladies have presented here really covers it. It's going to be interesting to get into some of the nitty-gritty around how do we achieve the trust that we need to from a technology perspective.
I want to ask a little bit about regulation in a few minutes, but one point that, and there's a word that keeps coming up, is I'd be interested in your views on this concept of network neutrality. That basically a platform, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, whether it's also a provider like Microsoft, whether this concept of network neutrality, which gets bounded about in so many ways, whether it's actually achievable. The reason why I ask is you see, let's use the example, we talked about this very briefly this morning, headlines in the newspapers over the past couple of days about staff within Facebook saying that they don't like the position that their CEO has taken about network neutrality if it involves politicians putting false messages up on their platform, fake messages, even if they know that they're wrong. And basically Mark Zuckerberg has said publicly, we're not prepared to take those down. He's been challenged by people like Elizabeth Warren, who's put up a fake message saying that they're supporting President Trump, which of course is not the case, but she's trying to prove a point. Is it possible, is it reasonable to expect these types of platforms to be network neutral? Do you think it is achievable when, we'll ask Theo in a minute, but when they're also, realistically, these companies are also trying to balance so many different things, including the sort of commercial driver to keep their numbers up?
So I think Twitter's quite an interesting example of this. Twitter had historically taken the position that it's not an arbiter of truth, and so would not take down content. But about a year ago came up with a new set of sort of a policy, very loosely phrased policy guidelines about how it deals with false information, specifically during election periods. And I think where these policies are trying to develop tries to, I suppose, create a harm threshold. So the point at which the platforms start to engage with these issues. I think what we're not trying to deal with is meaningless gossip or, erroneous, just errors of fact. We've seen, quite to the contrary, that in a number of countries around Africa, we're actually trying to decriminalize the offense of false news, which was an offense used to kind of clamp down on journalists where there was an error of fact in their stories with very severe penalties. So that's not what we're dealing with here. But where there is a genuine threat, I suppose, to the credibility of the elections, that's something that I think, in the same way that content moderation around hate speech, for example, is used, there I think there is a responsibility. Some platforms have taken the view that if you don't like the platform, don't use it. But given the prevalence of it, I'm fairly sure that's not actually a legitimate response. So I do think more can be done. It just takes, I suppose, the will to do it and putting in place the measures.
And I think at Twitter, I just sort of dug out, I was sitting on a list of things that Twitter is trying to do, but it's among a number of companies that regularly publish these kind of audits of what it's done, what it's taken down, what it's kept up there, as a way of trying to push for more transparency.
Yes, absolutely.
Dr. Suzuka, what do you think? Do you think this area of neutrality is possible? Is it achievable? Is it the same as a newspaper saying don't shoot the messenger? Or do we have these platforms in an entirely different space simply because of the numbers of people that are using them simultaneously? I mean, Facebook's using 2.1 billion people using Facebook every day, in most extraordinary numbers.
I can certainly understand the sentiment of not wanting to be an arbiter of truth. I do understand that. However, can we achieve neutrality? I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure because at some point, when all the evidence that you have in front of you seems to suggest that something is not true, you should be able to. You should feel an obligation to take it down. If it is going to incite hatred, incite, pump up emotions, I don't know. I think it's a big moral dilemma because I can see how the platforms would say, look, I don't want to get involved with that. I'm simply providing a platform, and people are going to use it in any way that they do. Except life is not that simple. I wish it was, but it is not. The question is what to do about it. Because every time that you propose a solution, if you say that I'm going to have an army of people who take things down, what are the measures? You've got to place the tolerance levels somewhere, and those pegging those tolerance levels does involve some kind of subjectivity that you have to impose. So I'm going to say what I said a couple of months ago before the May elections in South Africa, and say we actually don't know. We are in a space where we actually do not know how best to do it. I am hoping that we will have an epiphany soon enough, sooner rather than later. But I don't think it is as simple as we make it. Truth in itself. We know that truth in itself depends on the lens that you use. But does that mean that there is no truth? I don't think that's what we mean.
Philosophical question, isn't it? Yes. And I guess, Sophia, the key to this is, speed. is that you think of how long it takes to set up a commission or a body to make the decisions about what are the rules,
Sure.
and then operating them. I mean,
Yeah.
how realistic is
Well,
it?
you've got freedom of speech on one hand, and on the other hand, you've got censorship. Who said to the technology platform that you are the judge, jury, and executioner in this space? So I think it's a pointed question. We fundamentally have to address the question. I don't think we have an answer yet. So the reality is that I think we need to start working together with civil society, with regulators, with large industry players to resolve and address the issue. When I again look at what we as a large corporation are doing, we certainly are mindful of this. We want to engage regulators. We want to talk to industry stakeholders. We think it's fundamentally important at the end of the day that this be resolved. The difficulty, and I think you put it perfectly, is what is the subjective level and standard by which we do this? I don't think we have answers around this. I address this specifically in some of the artificial intelligence discussions. What is the unintended consequence of taking down a person's written publication? That was his freedom of speech. Now, did it border on hate speech? Was it informative? Was it a personal opinion? And I think we're going to grapple with this. In the old days, if I can call it that, we have reporters, we have publications. It takes, hours, days to get this out. We have a legal system around defamation and addressing these kinds of issues. Now, all of a sudden, I post something on WhatsApp. I post something on Twitter. And it's wildfire. How do you take it down? I don't think you can address it without the Twitter, without the platform participant. But what are the rules and regulations that can address this at speed? I don't think we have answers. I know that we're working on some AI situations. We have AI solutions. We have threat protection solutions. Even when there's an election, we have a thing called Election Guard. So we're trying to work through this kind of stuff. But the reality is that I don't think we're going to have an answer anytime soon. We probably need to rely on those old-fashioned values, but we need to sort of mix in some speedy technology to assist us to get to a decision-making point. But beyond that, I think it's going to be for the industry, for the stakeholders and the regulators to work out.
We've got lawyers in the room, and there's obviously a lot of that. There are goodness knows how many commissions and how many initiatives that are looking at this issue globally. And I know we've got representatives from the open-ended working group that South Africa sits on at UN level, which is looking to discuss some of these issues alongside cyber issues as well. How much, and this is for all of you, do you get a sense that, let's take the South African context, there is an appetite to work with the private sector on these issues? Because it seems to me sometimes there is a bit of a them and an us situation, that government does government stuff, civil society engages at a civil society level, and there's less crossover with the private sector. The regulations that we've come up with at the moment, have they involved some private sector input? Just remind us of some of the regulations that would cover us insofar as we can cover ourselves for some of these challenges, and have they had private sector involvement and input?
Yes, I think we've seen a bit of a mixed bag. I think, public participation is something that's kind of mandated in terms of our laws, and so in terms of any legislation that's passed, it's required. And so we have seen public-private sector input. Whether that's sought out directly by the state, I think, is still relatively limited. And so the Cybercrimes Bill, for all of the faults that it had initially, was perhaps one of the best examples of a really effective consultative process. The first draft of the bill was terrible. It received very bad feedback, was really concerning in terms of the rights infringement that it had for free speech, and a fundamental, I suppose, misalignment and misunderstanding about the way in which the technology would apply, or traditional laws would apply online. And then there was a very rigorous consultative process in which a drafting committee was established, including members of people from the parliamentary portfolio committees, people from civil society, academia, and the industry. And a much better draft was worked out following from that process. But it's one of the very rare examples that we've seen, unfortunately. We often see the private sector involved when we're talking about investment opportunities, economic growth, but as soon as it comes to political decisions, suddenly there's a reticence, I think. And I don't think we've seen enough done to kind of harness the importance of that collaborative function. I think during the last elections, the Electoral Commission worked very effectively with civil society and some of the platforms to deal with disinformation, which I think was a very useful initiative. I mentioned to you yesterday in India, the tech platforms during the 2019, the elections earlier this year, Facebook, Google, Twitter, and a few others came together and prepared a draft code of conduct, which they then presented to the Electoral Commission on how they would deal with disinformation and political advertising. Now there was already a legislative framework in place, and what the tech companies did was explain how, in terms of their own policies and standards, they would give effect to that framework.
In that jurisdiction,
In
which
that
is
jurisdiction.
the critical point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So just for that jurisdiction. But it wasn't then transcended more broadly. We see very effective measures in the European Union, for example, being taken to address disinformation, a lot of resources being invested in that. But the same is not being translated into South Africa, for example, because the priorities of the jurisdictions vary so significantly. And I think the problem is regulation is in its nature reactive, whereas technology is proactive. And so the regulation has consistently lagged behind the technology. And I think we're still struggling to deal with that kind of time lag. And whether we're doing enough to get better at it, I'm a little bit skeptical about.
Okay. Well, I think one of the things that I would like to put on the table is the fact that one of the difficulties about this subject and the elections is that we focus on election day. Yeah. And those kinds of issues, the forming of prejudices and all of those things, it happens all the time. And it has a cumulative effect on elections. So, for example, the things that are going to decide the elections that will be run in South Africa in local government in 2021 are playing out right now, and the effect of the texture of the conversations that are happening on the platforms are eventually going to determine how that election plays out. So, if and business, the way that it operates is that it operates. I'm being facetious here.
You used to work Standard Bank as well. So
I'm seeing a laser pointer here.
Yeah, is that you think about performance is defined on a quarterly basis, and so when someone starts talking about something that's going to happen in 2021. People are polite, so they just glaze, and it becomes very difficult to deal with. So I think we need to bring some sophistication in the way that we deal with the matters, because on the continent and everywhere else, the issues that decide an election don't happen on election day. They happen long before, and therefore the conversations have to happen way before. The interaction with the platforms has to happen way before.
how do you get African leaders interested? Because we're talking regionally in this one. There are so many other. If we can't get large numbers to sign, say the Malibu Protocol, or Abney was talking about codes of conduct and a standard, and very, very few have actually signed up to it. How do you make this matter? How do you make this matter to leadership here?
I think one of the biggest problems that we have is that at that level, it's fairly easy to sign a protocol. It's fairly easy to sign a treaty. It's what politicians do every day, and the fact that people have signed up all of these things, and we write them in the introduction of every report, and you write what a jurisdiction has signed up to, it's quite a lot. The trick, though, is in how to keep, once again, the quality of your representatives, to keep their eyes on the ball, to make sure that what it is that has been signed, all that brings to bear onto a better quality election. And part, I think, of what has happened is that our ability to stay interested in something precisely because of the digital age, has become shorter and shorter. So our time span is limited to a lovely program that will be done in exactly 50 minutes. And I know where it started, I know where it ended. Anything longer than that, I can't process. And so to make not just the political leadership, but the general citizen to stay connected with an issue that is going to be important and that's going to decide an election. If I may, and just look at Mozambique, for example. If people compartmentalize the discussion around the discovery of gas, the peace deal, and elections, and they don't see a thread running through all of those things. And when you're an election management body, you are told just focus on making sure that there are ballot boxes, that this. In South Africa, though, you have the fortunate position where the very law that births the election management body gives the election management body the duty not just to run elections, but to entrench constitutional democracy. And therefore, in South Africa at least, you can push the election management body to care a bit more and to stay focused a bit more. In jurisdictions where the election management body is seen as purely as an events management enterprise, you're going to have difficulty in trying to achieve what Avani was talking about, because it takes time for you to bring together all those very disparate players onto the table and keep them interested. They watch the space. We are never going to get to the solution if we don't keep people around the table for long enough for something to dawn upon us.
Though we have to remind them of the vulnerabilities. I mean, I was reading that the Cambridge Analytica scandal, there were 60,000 South African accounts that were compromised by that amount of personal data. I think there is a great sense that this thing doesn't matter to us. It's something that happens elsewhere. You know, there is a real danger, isn't there? Kenya's already been used as a testing ground for Cambridge Analytica. There is a real danger that because of so much else on our plate and because of the sense of remoteness, that actually, in a way, this continent becomes a testing ground for precisely these kinds of antics, simply because we are so vulnerable. So, if anything, there is more of a reason for our leadership to care about these things and to think slightly more long-term by reminding them of the interconnectedness of things.
If I may, Karen, we talk about Kenya in relation to an election. But South Africa just yesterday, when we're dealing with the eruption of violence against foreigners, the social media played quite a significant role there. We have had our own Cambridge Analytica in South Africa as well. And there are many. They may not be of the scale of Cambridge Analytica in Brexit, in the American elections, for example. But we have these cases unfolding in South Africa quite a lot of time. But I don't think we are paying enough attention long enough to take evidence that is in front of us that we can pull together and make a change. Our saving grace, I think, in South Africa is that we are, if there's anything that we are sure about, is that you will not compromise our freedom of speech. At least that is one thing that South Africans agree on. Don't compromise my freedom of speech. But everything else, the responsibility that comes with that right, is something I think that there's enough evidence, I think, out there in this country that we can bring to bear in order to think this matter through.
I think it's interesting when you look at along these lines, and I like the way you put it, fully agree, but I like there's sort of a long-term issue and there's an immediacy issue. When I think about the average South African struggling to make a living, 30-odd% unemployment. There's an immediacy in what drives their behavior. And I just think about privacy. You think about a breach, a data breach. The average South African is not going to see the consequence. They're not going to, that consequence isn't going to resonate with them because the immediacy of their issue is far more dire. So, when it comes, I think, to that issue of how do we engage between private sector and government, I think it's a difficult question to answer. It has to happen. But there are conflicting interests that are driving it. Big business is seen as driving after revenues and profits. Government is trying to appease a political agenda potentially. How do you bring this together? I don't think there's any magic answer, but it's something around understanding what is going on with a particular society.
Do you think, Avni gave the example of what had happened in India with the different platforms coming together and signing a code of conduct. Within a jurisdiction, that's achievable. But do you think that it is possible globally to come up with a similar something? There have been various pacts, there have been accords, there have been statements of trust. But is it conceivable that, because the idea of freedom of information is so elastic, and there's no surprise why so many of the companies locate themselves in the United States.
I'd love to see that, Karen. I really would. But I don't think it is. And it's human nature. There's a reason we have sovereignty.
Yeah.
There's a reason we worry about who has my data and where's my data going. There's a reason why we have bad actors sitting outside our borders, because there's a difference in laws which allow them to manipulate and basically run wild in a free, literally a Wild West scenario. So, I fall back to something like privacy. You have the Europeans that are particularly worried about it. They've raised the bar in putting out the GDPR. And then where's the rest of the world? South Africa, we have our privacy regulator. I'm glad to see the regulator putting out requests to engage. It's fantastic, but it's taking too long. Mm-hmm. So, and I don't think I want to blame the regulator. You try and establish a regulator dealing with those unintended long-term consequences that we discussed earlier. But I don't know how the funding's going. I don't know what the budget is looking like. Do they have the expertise? These are really difficult things for them to arrange and deal with. But at least they're engaging. But ultimately, I don't think it's going to be something that we will see in our lifetimes. Sadly, I would love to see it. But I think that there is perhaps just too much of a political disparity out in the globe to ever allow for that unified approach.
So perhaps we need to grow digital literacy among the population at large, so we become a little bit more discerning and a bit more responsible for what they're doing.
I do also want to remark that I think a lot of the time we talk about the government, we talk about the election management body, we talk about private sector, etc., etc. And very little responsibility is put on the shoulders of the political players themselves. And I think political campaigning is just that. It is about the rules of the game. And what we find is that they will agree on a particular code of conduct before they will sign up to a code of conduct. But look at what happens, and there is very little appetite in terms of keeping political players honest. There's very little appetite everywhere we go. Nobody wants to deal with that. There's very little regulation. There's very little everything around the behavior of political parties themselves.
And how they conduct themselves online.
And how they conduct themselves, and how they can get away with murder. How they can promise one thing and and do something totally different and get away with it, and it's okay.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Well, look, we're going to open the floor to questions in a minute. It's at this point that we have to say goodbye to our online audience. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody around the world that's been watching this ISS webcast, and thank you to my panel here. We have guests here in the offices, and I'd very much like to open the floor to you. There is a microphone that is being circulated. There's a microphone that's about